There is a room, somewhere in the world, where a small device sits on a shelf and hums. It is not much to look at. A metal box, no larger than a paperback book, connected by a thin cable to a computer that never sleeps. Inside the box, something is happening that should be the purest form of nothing. An electrical circuit is producing noise, not sound. Electrical noise. The random, meaningless jitter of electrons that has no cause, no pattern, no purpose. The device takes that noise and turns it into numbers. Ones and zeros. Millions of them. Every second, without pause, without rest, without any intention whatsoever. The machine does not know what it is doing. It does not know what a number is. It does not know that it sits on a shelf, in a room, in a building, on a planet where 8 billion people are currently loving and grieving and lying awake in the dark. It simply produces randomness. That is its only job. That is the entire point. And for most of its life, it does that job perfectly. The ones and the zeros come out in a long, grey, featureless stream, like static from an empty channel, like the hiss between radio stations, like the sound the universe makes when nobody is talking. Nothing. 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 But sometimes, according to the people who watch those numbers, something happens. Sometimes the static stops being static. And the strangest part, the part that has troubled scientists and thrilled conspiracy theorists and refused to go away for more than 25 years, is when it happens. It happens when we're all feeling the same thing at the same time. Tonight, we are going to trace that idea from its beginning to its end. We are going to walk through a real experiment, conducted at a real university, by real scientists, with real data that real statisticians still argue about. And then, very slowly, we're going to walk past the edge of what is known into the shadowed territory where the documents get thinner and the questions get stranger. I want to be honest with you before we go any further. The Global Consciousness Project is real. Roger Nelson is real. The random number generators are real. And the data is real. And the arguments about that data are very real and very unresolved. But most scientists do not accept the project's conclusions. They believe the anomalies are statistical artifacts, the natural result of looking at enormous amounts of noise and finding faces in the clouds. What comes after, the classified programs, the desert facility, the woman named Eleanor Hart, is a story. A story built on the bones of something real, but a story. So take it as that. Take it as a thing to fall asleep to, but understand that the bones are real. And the bones are strange enough on their own. Let's go back to the beginning. To understand why anyone would build a machine to detect the human soul, you have to understand what came before. For most of recorded history, the idea that human beings are connected by something invisible was not a fringe belief. It was the default assumption. It was so ordinary that nobody bothered to argue for it, because nobody thought to argue against it. Every major religious tradition has some version of it. The idea that when many people pray together, something happens that would not happen if they prayed alone. The idea that a congregation is more than the sum of its members. The idea that grief moves through a village like weather. That joy is contagious in a way that has nothing to do with facial expressions or social cues. That there is a temperature to a room full of frightened people that you can feel the instant you walk in. Philosophers had words for it. Mystics had rituals for it. Ordinary people simply lived inside it and never questioned it, the way a fish does not question water. And then came the 17th century, and the 18th, and the 19th, and with them came something extraordinary and something devastating at the same time. Science. Science gave us so much. It gave us medicine and electricity and flight, and the understanding that the stars are suns. It gave us the ability to see the machinery of the world and to name its parts. But in order to do that, science had to make a promise. It had to promise to only believe what it could measure, and you cannot measure a feeling in a room. So the invisible connection between human beings was quietly demoted. It became metaphor. It became poetry. It became a nice thing to say at funerals. The scientific consensus, hardening through the 19th century and locking into place through the 20th, was simple and clear and in its way quite lonely. You are a body. Your mind is a process inside that body. It is generated by your brain, contained by your skull, and it ends where you end. What you feel alone. What I feel alone. And any sensation that we are somehow connected is a trick of the nervous system, an evolutionary shortcut, a comforting lie. This became the water we swim in. This is the assumption most of us carry without ever examining it. You are in there, and I am in here, and the space between us is empty. The scientists who eventually built the machines were not trying to overturn all of that. Not at first. They were just curious. Princeton University, New Jersey, the 1970s. There is a laboratory in the basement of the engineering building that most of the campus does not know about. It has a name that sounds deliberately boring. The Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory, PEER for short. It was founded by a man named Robert Jahn, and Robert Jahn was not a mystic. He was not a fringe figure. He was the Dean of the School of Engineering and Applied Science at Princeton University. He was an aerospace engineer of genuine distinction. He built rocket propulsion systems. He was, by every measure, exactly the kind of person the scientific establishment holds up as an example of what a serious researcher looks like. And he decided to spend the last decades of his career testing whether human beings could influence machines with their minds. He did not decide this out of nowhere. A student had come to him with a proposal, and Jahn, being the sort of man who took questions seriously rather than dismissing them, had said yes. And then he had looked at the results, and then he could not stop looking. The setup was almost insultingly simple. You take a machine that produces random output, you put a person in front of it, you ask the person to try, using nothing but intention, to push the output in one direction, more ones than zeros, or more zeros than ones. You run the experiment thousands of times. You compare the results to what pure chance would predict. That is all. There is no ritual. There is no incense. There is no talk of energy or auras or vibrations. There is a machine, a person, a chair, and a number. The prediction, from every mainstream model of physics and psychology, is unambiguous. Nothing will happen. The machine does not care what you want. The electrons do not have ears. Your intention has exactly as much effect on a random number generator as it has on the weather in another solar system, which is to say, none at all. Jahn ran the experiment for nearly 30 years, and the results were not nothing. They were, in fact, almost nothing. That is the part that makes the story so maddening, and so hard to dismiss, and so hard to accept. The effect size was tiny, vanishingly small. If chance predicted that the machine would produce a certain balance of ones and zeros, then the human operators, over millions upon millions of trials, shifted that balance by a fraction of a percent. You would never see it in a single session. You would never see it in 100 sessions. It was so small that it was invisible to any individual experience. But it was consistent. And when you accumulate a tiny consistent deviation over millions of trials, the statistics begin to speak. Not loudly, but they speak. The PEER lab reported that their results were significantly unlikely to be the product of chance. Not impossible. Unlikely. The odds, by their calculations, ran into the thousands to one against, and in some analyses far beyond that. The scientific community's response was, in the main, extremely negative. The criticisms were serious and they were not unreasonable. Critics pointed out that when you run experiments for 30 years, you have enormous freedom in how you analyse the data, and that freedom can manufacture significance out of noise. They pointed out that the effect never got stronger, never became reliably reproducible in other laboratories, never did the thing that real effects do, which is to become clearer and cleaner as the methods improve. They pointed out that a great deal of the reported effect seemed to come from a small number of operators, which raised uncomfortable questions, and underneath all of the technical objections was something simpler and more human. If this is true, then everything is different. That is not a small ask, and science, correctly, asks for extraordinary evidence when the claim is extraordinary. A tiny statistical deviation accumulated over decades in a laboratory that everyone already suspects of wanting a particular answer, is not extraordinary evidence. The Pear Laboratory closed in 2007. Robert Jahn stood by his results until his death. The scientific mainstream did not follow him, but by then one of his colleagues had already taken the idea somewhere much stranger. His name was Roger Nelson. Roger Nelson was a psychologist who had worked at the Pear Lab through its most active years. He was the man who ran the machines, who managed the data, who spent his days staring at streams of numbers that were supposed to mean nothing. And somewhere in those years, he had a thought. The thought was this: every experiment we have run has involved one person, sitting in a chair, trying very hard to influence a machine, and the effect, if it exists at all, is almost too small to see. But what if the number of people is the variable? What if one person's intention is a whisper, and the reason we can barely hear it is that a whisper is all it is? What would a shout sound like? What would 100 million people, all feeling the same thing, at the same instant sound like? He began with small experiments. He would take a portable random number generator to gatherings, religious ceremonies, theatrical performances, rituals, places where a group of people were in some sense unified, where attention was pulled into a single focus and held there. He called it field consciousness research, and the idea was that you did not need to ask anyone to do anything. You did not need to instruct people to concentrate on the machine. In fact, nobody in the room needed to know the machine existed at all. You simply put the device where the emotion was, and you watched. And Nelson reported that during moments of what he called coherence, when the group's attention truly locked together, when the ceremony reached its climax or the performance reached its peak, the numbers drifted. Not much, never much, always in that infuriating margin where a skeptic can say coincidence and never be proven wrong. But drifted. So Nelson had his hypothesis, and it was elegant and it was testable, and it was, in a way that must have taken his breath away when he first understood it, enormous. If a room full of people can nudge a machine, then what about a country? What about a planet? There are moments when the entire human species is looking at the same thing. Think about that for a second. Really sit with it, because it is a genuinely strange fact about the world we have built. For nearly all of human history, this was impossible. A village in one valley could be celebrating a wedding while a village in the next valley was burying its dead, and neither would know, and the news would take weeks to travel if it travelled at all. Human emotion was local, it was contained, it moved at the speed of a horse. And then, in the space of about 100 years, we built the telegraph and the radio and the television and the satellite and the internet, and something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth became possible. Simultaneity. An event can now happen in one place, and within minutes billions of people can be watching it. Not hearing about it later, watching it, feeling it, in the same hour, in the same breath. We have never had this before. Not once, not in 300,000 years of being human. And Roger Nelson looked at that and thought, if there is such a thing as a collective mind, then this is the first moment in history when it could possibly wake up. So he decided to listen. The project was formally launched in 1998. It was called the Global Consciousness Project, and its instrument was a network. Not a single machine in a single lab, but dozens of machines scattered across the surface of the planet, all doing the same meaningless thing at the same time. They gave the network a nickname, and the nickname is the kind of thing that tells you these people knew exactly how strange their work sounded and had decided to lean into it anyway. They called it the EGG, the electrogaiagram. Gaia, the Earth. Gram, a recording. An electrical recording of the planet, the way an electroencephalogram is an electrical recording of a brain. They were, quite literally, attaching electrodes to the world. Each node in the network was a random number generator, a device engineered to produce output that no one, including the device, could predict. Some used quantum tunneling, some used thermal noise. All of them were built to the same standard, which is that their output must be irreducibly, fundamentally random. not merely complicated, but genuinely without cause. The devices went out to volunteers and collaborators around the world. They were installed in university laboratories in Europe, in research facilities in Asia, in private homes in South America, in offices, in basements, in spare rooms, in cities whose names most of us will never learn. Each one generated 200 bits per second. Each second, it summed those bits into a single number and sent that number to a server at Princeton. And then the network simply ran, day after day, month after month, year after year, producing nothing. This is the part of the story that I think gets lost, and it is the part I find most beautiful. For the overwhelming majority of its existence, this experiment produced exactly what it was supposed to produce, which was noise. Featureless, meaningless, perfectly ordinary noise. A grey river of numbers flowing through servers in New Jersey, meaning nothing, saying nothing, going nowhere. That is what a random number generator does. That is what it is for. The researchers had a hypothesis, and the hypothesis was that on certain days, on certain specific days, when something happened to us all at once, the river would ripple. They wrote down their predictions in advance. This matters. This is the part that separates the project from a man reading tea leaves. Before an event, or in the case of unexpected events, before examining the data, they would formally register a prediction. On this date, at this time, for this duration, we expect the network to deviate from randomness. Then they would look. Between 1998 and the present, they registered more than 500 such predictions. New Year's Eve, when a wave of celebration rolls around the planet time zone by time zone. Major religious observances when hundreds of millions of people turn toward the same idea at the same hour. Elections, disasters, funerals of the famous and the beloved. And on one particular morning in September, something none of them saw coming. Let me tell you about that morning. I want to be careful here, because this is not a mystery. It is not a curiosity. It is not a fun anomaly to puzzle over. It is the worst day in living memory for a great many people, and some of them may be listening tonight. So let us be gentle with it. On the 11th of September, in the year 2001, a series of coordinated attacks were carried out against the United States. Nearly 3,000 people died. The images of that morning were broadcast, live and unedited, into homes across every continent on Earth. And what happened next was, in the history of human experience, almost without precedent. The entire world stopped and looked at the same thing, not sequentially, not over the course of days, simultaneously. Within an hour of the first impact, an appreciable fraction of the entire human species was watching the same footage, feeling the same lurch of horror, and understanding that something had fundamentally changed. If there was ever going to be a moment when a collective consciousness became detectable, this was it. The Global Consciousness Project had 37 random number generators running that day, scattered across the planet. And according to Roger Nelson and his colleagues, those machines behaved strangely. The reported deviation on that day was among the largest in the project's history. The network's output, which should have been a flat, featureless line of pure randomness, showed a pronounced departure from what chance would predict. The researchers calculated the odds of such a deviation occurring by accident and reported them as being on the order of 1,000 to 1 against. This is the finding that took the Global Consciousness Project from an obscure academic curiosity to something that people talked about in bars and forums and late-night radio shows for the next 20 years. And I want to give the skeptics their moment here, because they deserve it, and because a story is not worth telling if you have to lie to make it work. The criticisms of the September 11th analysis are substantial. The first and most damning is a problem that statisticians call flexibility of analysis. When you're looking for a deviation in a data stream, you have to decide, before you look, exactly what window of time you're examining and exactly what kind of deviation counts. If you decide those things after seeing the data, you can almost always find something. Critics argued that the project's analytical choices were not sufficiently locked down, and that in a data stream as vast as this one, some window somewhere will always contain something that looks meaningful. The second is the problem of the file drawer, though the project has tried hard to address this by publishing all of its formal predictions. Still, critics ask, how many events were there in that period which produced nothing? How many earthquakes? How many massacres? How many moments of collective grief in parts of the world that Western researchers were less likely to register as globally significant? The third is the simplest, and in some ways the most devastating. There is no mechanism. There is no theory in physics that would allow a person's emotional state to influence the quantum behaviour of a diode in a box on a shelf on another continent. None. Not a controversial one, not a fringe one. None. And when you have an effect with no mechanism, an effect that is very small, an effect found by researchers who badly wanted to find it, the responsible scientific position is to assume you have made a mistake. Most scientists take that position. I want to be very clear about that. The mainstream view is that the Global Consciousness Project is measuring nothing, and that its anomalies are the natural artifacts of looking very hard at a very large amount of noise. That is where the science ends. That is where the story begins. Because here is the question that the skeptics answer, and the conspiracy theorists refuse to let go of. If the anomalies are meaningless noise, why do they cluster? The project reported anomalies not only on September 11th, but on a scattering of other days that share something in common. The funeral of Princess Diana, when hundreds of millions watched a coffin move slowly through London. The Indian Ocean tsunami, when a wave crossed an ocean and took 250,000 people. The turning of the millennium, when the whole planet counted down together hour by hour, time zone by time zone. The skeptic says, of course. Those are the days you chose to look at. You chose the days when everyone was watching, and then you were surprised to find something on the days when everyone was watching. That is not a discovery. That is a definition. And the skeptic is probably right. But there is a version of this story where the skeptic is wrong, and that version is where we're going now. Everything I've told you so far is, to the best of my ability, true. Everything I'm about to tell you is not. Here is where we cross the line. Her name is Dr. Eleanor Hart, and she is not a believer. I want to establish that immediately, because it matters for everything that follows. Eleanor Hart is a cognitive scientist at a small research university, and she has spent her entire career being extremely, professionally, almost tediously careful. She studies attention. Specifically, she studies the failures of attention, the small mundane ways in which human perception is unreliable, the tricks and gaps and confabulations that make us so bad at knowing what we have actually seen. She is, in other words, a professional skeptic. Her whole job is understanding why people believe things that are not true. She's 44 years old. She lives alone in a house that is slightly too large for her, in a town where it rains for 8 months of the year. She sleeps badly. She reads before bed, and it does not help. And in the autumn of a year that is close enough to now that we do not need to name it, she receives a phone call from a lawyer. An old colleague has died, a man named Marcus Feld who taught at Princeton, and who had, decades ago, supervised the first year of her doctoral work before she transferred to a different program and a different life. She had not spoken to him in 15 years. She had barely thought of him. He has left her his papers, not his money, not his books, his papers. Every file, every notebook, every folder from a career that spanned 5 decades. 61 boxes currently sitting in a storage unit in New Jersey, and if she does not claim them within 90 days, they will be destroyed. She almost lets them go. That is the detail I want you to hold on to as you drift. She almost lets them go. She stands in her kitchen with the phone against her ear, looking out the window at the rain, and she is genuinely on the verge of saying no. She has too much to do. She has a grant application due. She has not thought about Marcus Feld in a decade and a half, and she is not sure she even liked him. And then she says yes, for no reason she could ever afterward explain. The boxes arrive on a Thursday. They fill her garage, they fill her spare room, they fill the hallway, so that for 2 weeks she has to walk sideways past a wall of cardboard to reach her own bedroom, and she begins, methodically, because she's a methodical person, to sort them. Most of it is exactly what you would expect from the papers of a working academic. Draft manuscripts with red ink in the margins, correspondence about conference travel, grant applications, funded and unfunded, photocopies of articles with sections underlined, grade books, committee minutes, the vast grey paper sediment of a life spent in a university. She works through it in the evenings, with the radio on and a glass of wine at her elbow, and she finds that she is enjoying it. There is something soothing about it. She's holding the artifacts of a life, and the life had shape, and the shape was reasonable, and someday someone will do this for her. She's in box 41 when she finds the folder. It is not hidden. That is the strange thing. She would later spend a great deal of time thinking about the fact that it was not hidden. It is simply there, in the middle of a box of otherwise unremarkable material from the 1990s, in a plain manila folder identical to 100 other plain manila folders. There is a label on the tab, 2 words typed on an actual typewriter, which even in the 1990s would have been an unusual choice. Event 0. She opens it. Inside are 11 pages. The first page is a memorandum, and the memorandum is dated. She checks the date twice, and then she puts the page down on the table and sits back in her chair and does not move for some time. The date is 1973. The Global Consciousness Project began in 1998. The Peer Laboratory, where all of this supposedly started, was founded in 1979. This memorandum is from 6 years before the beginning. The document is a technical summary, and it is written in a register that Eleanor recognizes immediately, because she has read 1,000 documents written in this register, and she knows exactly what it is. It is not academic prose. Academic prose argues. Academic prose hedges and qualifies and situates itself within a literature. This document does not argue. It reports. It is written for someone who does not need to be persuaded, only informed. It is written for a superior, and what it reports is this: that an array of 11 electronic devices described only as stochastic output units have been deployed at 11 locations across the continental United States, and that their output had been continuously monitored for a period of 14 months, and that during that period, 7 statistically significant deviation events had been recorded. 7, and beside each one, in a plain table, a date and a time and a duration. And beside each date, a second column, and the second column is what makes Eleanor Hart stand up and walk to her window and press her hand flat against the cold glass. The second column is labelled Correlate, and in each row of that column is the name of an event. She knows these events. Everyone knows these events. They are the events that were taught to her in school, that were in the documentaries, that were in the histories, assassinations, disasters, the great collective wounds of the middle of the century. She looks at the table for a long time, and then she notices the thing that will destroy the next 2 years of her life. The times are wrong. The deviation events do not occur at the same moment as the correlates. They occur before them, not by much, not by days or weeks. The offsets are measured in hours, 2 hours, 6 hours, in one case 19 minutes. But every single one of them is negative. The machines drifted, and then the thing happened. Every time. She does not sleep that night. She sits at her kitchen table with the 11 pages spread out in front of her, and she does what any good scientist does when confronted with something impossible, which is to look for the mistake. There must be a mistake. There is always a mistake. That is what her entire career has taught her. When the data says something impossible, the data is wrong, or the analysis is wrong, or the instrument is wrong, or the person is wrong, and the job of the scientist is to find out which. So she tries. Perhaps the timestamps use a different convention. Perhaps they are recorded in a time zone she is not accounted for, or in some military format, or relative to some arbitrary epoch. She works through every possibility she can construct, and none of them produce a consistent shift that would eliminate the offsets. The offsets are not uniform. They range from 19 minutes to just over 6 hours. No time zone error produces a range like that. Perhaps the correlates were assigned after the fact. This is the obvious answer, and for a while she is satisfied with it. Someone looked at 11 machines producing noise for 14 months, found 7 wobbles, and then went hunting through the newspapers for something dramatic that happened nearby in time. That is not science. That is astrology. That would explain everything, except that the document contains a section, buried on page 9, which is not a report of results. It is a schedule. It is a schedule of predicted deviation windows, and it is dated in advance. The methodology, described in 3 dense paragraphs of technical language, is this. The array is monitored continuously. When a deviation exceeding a defined threshold is detected, the system flags it in real time. The flag is logged with a timestamp before any external event has occurred. They were not finding wobbles and then hunting for events. They were finding wobbles and then waiting. And according to page 9, in 7 cases out of 7, something came. She takes the folder to the university and photocopies every page, twice, and puts 1 copy in a safe deposit box, and she is aware while she's doing this that she has become, in the space of a single night, a slightly different person than she was. Then she starts looking for Marcus Feld's other papers. Because here is the thing about a man who leaves you 61 boxes. If he wanted you to find something, he did not put it in a locked drawer. He put it in box 41, in a plain folder, in the middle of nothing, where only someone who read every single page would ever see it. He did not hide it. He filtered for patience. The rest of it takes her 4 months to assemble, and it comes not from one place but from 100. She finds a shipping manifest in box 19. She finds a page of handwritten notes in box 6, tucked inside a photocopied article about something else entirely. She finds a photograph, undated, of 11 metal cabinets in a room with no windows, and on the back of the photograph, in pencil, a single word she does not recognise. Oracle. She begins filing requests. Freedom of information requests to agencies whose names she has to look up. She does not expect anything. She is doing it, she tells herself, as a formality, as a way of proving to herself that there is nothing there so that she can stop. 11 weeks later, an envelope arrives. It is thin. Inside are 4 pages, and 3 of them are almost entirely black. But the 4th page has a header, and the header has a program name, and the program name is Oracle, and beneath it, in the small unredacted margins, are fragments. A budget line, a range of years, 1971 to 1979, an objective statement of which only the first 6 words survive, to determine whether aggregate human affective states, and then black to the bottom of the page. She reads those 6 words perhaps 400 times over the following week. Aggregate human affective states. That is a bureaucrat's way of saying what everybody is feeling all at once, to determine whether what everybody is feeling all at once can do something, and that word determine is the word that keeps her awake. Because determine is not the word you use when you are wondering. Determine is the word you use when you have already seen something, and you need to know how much of it is real. You do not launch a classified program to find out whether an idea is worth investigating. You launch a classified program because something has already happened, and you need to know what it was. Let me tell you what the world looked like in 1971, because it explains everything. It is easy, from here, to imagine the Cold War as a chess game. 2 rational powers, each holding terrible weapons, each behaving with grim logic. That is how it is taught. That is how it appears in the histories. That is not what it felt like from inside. From inside, it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff in the dark, holding hands with someone you did not trust, both of you leaning slightly forward. And in that atmosphere, The people responsible for national security developed a particular kind of institutional psychology, and it is a psychology that is difficult to understand unless you sit with it for a moment. It goes like this. We cannot afford to be wrong. Not, we should investigate promising leads. Not, we should allocate resources rationally. The logic was simpler and more terrible than that. If there is any possibility, however remote, that the other side has found a capability we have not, and if that capability would be decisive, then we must pursue it, regardless of how absurd it appears, because the cost of being wrong is not embarrassment. The cost of being wrong is everything. This is why the United States government spent 20 years and a great deal of money investigating remote viewing. This is a matter of public record. The program was real, it was classified, and its files were eventually released. Men and women sat in rooms and attempted to describe locations they had never visited, thousands of miles away, using nothing but their minds. The program produced, by the assessment of the review that finally shut it down, nothing of operational value, but it ran for 20 years, not because anyone in charge believed it. That is the part people get wrong. It ran because nobody in charge could afford to be certain it was worthless. Now, into that environment, in 1971, imagine dropping the following observation. We have an array of electronic sensors deployed for an unrelated purpose, and they are producing anomalous readings. And when we chart the anomalies against world events, the anomalies come first. You do not need to believe that. You do not need to have a theory for how it could possibly work. You only need to be unable to prove it is nothing. And then, in that world, in that decade, with that logic, you write a memorandum, and at the bottom of the memorandum you write a request for funding, and the funding is approved because the alternative is to explain to a superior why you decided, on your own authority, that the strange thing was not worth investigating. Project Oracle did not begin because someone believed in a collective human mind. It began because someone was afraid not to. The word that appears again and again in the surviving fragments is not consciousness. Eleanor notices this early, and it takes her a long time to understand why it matters. The word is field. There is a reason for that, and it is not poetic. It is a decision. Somebody, early on, decided that this program would not use the language of mysticism, and instead would use the language of physics, and that decision is the single most important thing in the entire archive, because a field is a real thing. A field is not a metaphor. When you hold two magnets near each other and feel them push apart, you're feeling a field. Nothing travels between them. No particle crosses the gap in any way you can see. And yet the force is real. It is measurable. It obeys precise equations, and it does not care whether you believe in it. For most of scientific history, action at a distance was considered an absurdity, a thing only a mystic would propose. And then it turned out that action at a distance is simply how the universe works, and we invented the concept of the field to describe it, and now it is so ordinary that we teach it to children. So the framers of Project Oracle asked the question in the only language that would let them ask it seriously. What if mind is a field? Not a soul, not a spirit, a field. Something that a physical system generates, that extends beyond the boundary of that system, and that can, under the right conditions, interact with other physical systems. Your brain generates electrical activity. That is not controversial. That is an electroencephalogram. And electrical activity, by the plainest laws we have, generates fields. This is not mysticism. This is Maxwell. The field generated by a single human brain is unimaginably weak. It is drowned, instantly and completely, by the electrical noise of a light switch in the next room. But fields add. That is what fields do. That is their fundamental property. Two sources, in phase, do not produce two signals. They produce one signal twice as strong, and 1,000,000 sources in phase produce a signal 1,000,000 times as strong. The word for that is coherence. A single flashlight and a laser both produce light. The difference is not power. The difference is that in the laser, every wave is in step with every other wave, and that coherence turns a diffuse glow into something that can cut steel. So here is the proposition, stated as coldly as the documents state it. 8 billion human brains, each generating a field too faint to measure, all of them normally out of phase with one another, all of them thinking about different things, cancelling one another out into an undifferentiated hum, incoherent, invisible. And then something happens. A tower falls, a wave comes, a king dies, a countdown reaches 0, and for a moment, an appreciable fraction of the human species is thinking about the same thing at the same time, feeling the same thing at the same time, in phase, coherent, and the laser turns on. I do not know if that is true. I want to say that clearly. There is no accepted physics that would allow it. The fields generated by neural activity fall away to nothing within centimetres of the skull, and there is no known mechanism by which they could couple to a diode in a sealed box on another continent, and the entire proposal collides with everything we understand about how the world is put together. But I want you to notice something about it before you fall asleep. It is not a stupid idea. It is wrong, almost certainly. But it is wrong in an interesting way. It is the kind of wrong that a serious person could arrive at honestly, by asking a reasonable question and following it somewhere unreasonable. And that is exactly the kind of wrong that a government in 1971, with the world on a hair trigger, would have been institutionally incapable of ignoring. Eleanor Hart spends the winter building a database. This is what a real scientist does with an impossible idea. She does not go on television. She does not write a book. She sits in a room and she builds a database. Because the only way to know whether a pattern is real is to look at all of it, including the parts that are inconvenient. She reconstructs, as best she can from the fragments, the deviation logs. She cross-references them against a timeline of world events that she assembles independently, using a coding system designed by 2 graduate students who do not know what the project is for and who are told, honestly, that it is a study in media salience. She is trying very hard to disprove this. I want that understood. Every methodological choice she makes is a choice designed to give the null hypothesis every possible advantage. She widens her windows. She includes events that nobody would call globally significant. She penalises herself for every degree of freedom, and in March, sitting at her desk at 2 a.m. with the rain coming down outside, she finds the thing that she cannot explain away. It is not the correlations. The correlations are suggestive and they are ambiguous, and she can construct half a dozen ways to make them vanish. It is the intervals, the deviation events, when you plot them not against world history but simply against each other, are not distributed the way random events are distributed. Random events cluster. That is a fact about randomness that most people find deeply counterintuitive. If you scatter 100 grains of rice on a table, you will see clumps and gaps, and the clumps mean nothing. True randomness looks lumpy. A perfectly even distribution is, in fact, evidence that something is arranging things. The deviation events are not lumpy. The gaps between them, measured in hours, cluster around a small set of values. And the values are not arbitrary. They are related to one another by simple ratios, 2:1, 3:2. The intervals fold into each other with the regularity of something tuned. She stares at it for an hour before she lets herself think the word. Harmonic. The gaps between the events are harmonics of one another. The way the strings of an instrument are harmonics of one another. The way an octave is a doubling. The events are not just correlated with the world. They are correlated with each other. They have a rhythm. She finds the facility because of an air conditioning bill. This is, she would say later, the single most human detail in the entire story, and the one that convinced her more thoroughly than any of the physics. Because a conspiracy can hide almost anything. It can classify documents, it can redact names, it can bury a program so deep that its own participants do not know what they are working on, but somebody has to pay for the electricity. The line item appears in a declassified appropriation schedule, one of thousands, in a document she requested essentially at random, a facility in Nevada described as an atmospheric research station with a stated staff of 9, and an annual cooling load appropriate to a building with a great deal of computing hardware inside it. 9 people do not generate that much heat. 9 people, in a research station studying the atmosphere, need a handful of workstations and a good coffee machine. Whatever is in that building is drawing power like a data center, and it is doing it in a place where nobody is meant to look. She drives out in June. She does not go in. I want to be clear about that because the version of this story that gets repeated in forums always has her going in, and that version is not true, and Eleanor Hart has never claimed it. She is not a spy. She is a 45-year-old cognitive scientist with a rental car and a folder of photocopies. She parks on a public road 3 miles away, and she looks at the building through a pair of binoculars she bought at a sporting goods store in Reno. It is not much to look at. A low concrete structure with a fenced perimeter and a gravel access road. There is a mast, and there are some instruments on the mast, and the instruments look exactly like what an atmospheric research station would have. And behind it, half sunk into the desert floor, are the cooling units. There are 14 of them. They are enormous. They are the size of shipping containers, arranged in 2 neat rows, and they are running, and even from 3 miles away through the binoculars, in the shimmering heat, she can see the air above them wavering. 14 industrial cooling units for a building with 9 employees in the middle of the Nevada desert. She sits in the car with the engine off and the windows down and the temperature climbing past 110, and she watches the building for 6 hours, and nobody comes and nobody goes. Then she drives back to Reno, and she sits in a motel room, and she thinks about what 14 cooling units means. It means that the building is not a receiver. That is the conclusion she comes to, at 2 a.m, in a motel room with a broken television, and it is the conclusion that changes the shape of everything. Because a receiver is small. A receiver is a device on a shelf, drawing a few watts, listening. The Global Consciousness Project, with its dozens of nodes scattered across the entire planet, could run on the power of a household appliance. That is what listening costs. Almost nothing. 14 industrial cooling units is not what listening costs. That is what transmitting costs. Here is the theory, and it is only a theory, and Eleanor Hart has never claimed otherwise. If the field is real, and if it is generated by coherent human emotion, and if a random number generator is sensitive to it, then a random number generator is a receiver. It is an antenna. It picks up the signal and turns it into a wobble in a stream of numbers. But every antenna is also, in principle, a transmitter. That is not a metaphor. That is an actual property of antennas, one of the deep and slightly beautiful symmetries of electromagnetism. The same piece of metal that can pick a signal out of the air can, if you drive it with power, push a signal into the air. Reciprocity, it is called. Receiving and transmitting are the same operation, run in opposite directions. And if you had a room with thousands of random number generators in it, and you did not simply let them run, but instead drove them, forced their output into a specific pattern, made them produce a coherent, structured, non-random signal, and did it at scale, with enough power to heat a building until it needed 14 industrial chillers to keep from cooking itself, then you would not be listening to the field. You would be talking to it. And there is only one thing on the receiving end of that channel. We are the field. There is no separate entity out there. That was never the claim. The field is not a thing that exists apart from humanity, floating in the ether, waiting. The field is what humanity is, when we are all feeling the same thing at once. It is the sum. It is us in phase. So if you build a machine that transmits into the field, you're not sending a message to something else. You're sending a message to everyone, not a message they would read, not words, not images, Nothing that would ever reach a conscious mind as a thought. Just a nudge, a pressure, a very slight bias in the direction that 8 billion moods happen to be drifting on a given day. A finger resting very gently on the scale of the human heart. And nobody would ever know. That is the thing. That is the horror of it. And it is a quiet horror, and I am telling it to you at night on purpose, because it is the kind of thought that only makes sense at night. You would never know. If someone shifted the emotional baseline of an entire civilization by a fraction of a percent, there would be no alarm. There would be no headline. There would be no moment where you sat up in bed and said, "Something has changed." There would only be a day when the news felt a little more frightening than it had to. A month where the arguments online were a little sharper than the subject warranted. A year where a country made a decision that, afterward, nobody could quite reconstruct the reasoning for. We are terrible at knowing why we feel the way we feel. That is Eleanor Hart's entire academic specialty, and it is the reason she, of all people, understood what she was looking at. The mind does not report its own causes, it invents them. Ask someone why they are in a bad mood, and they will give you an answer, and the answer will be confident and coherent, and it will very often be completely wrong. We are already living inside a story we tell ourselves about our own feelings. A machine that adjusted the input would not need to be subtle. We would do the subtlety for it. We would take the nudge and we would build an explanation around it, and the explanation would feel like ours. Now, I have been telling you a story about a government, and about a program, and about a facility in the desert, and it is a story about someone doing something to us. But Eleanor Hart's final conclusion is not that. Her final conclusion is stranger, and, I think, sadder. She spends a year with the data, and at the end of that year she writes a paper that no journal will accept, and the paper's central claim is not that a secret agency has been manipulating the human field. It is that they tried, and they failed because they had the direction of causation exactly backwards. Go back to the offsets. Go back to the thing that started all of this, the 7 events in the 1970s, the deviations that came before the disasters. Everyone who has ever looked at that data has drawn the same conclusion, and the conclusion is precognition. The machines saw the future. The field knows what is coming. Eleanor Hart thinks that is wrong. She thinks the field does not predict events. She thinks events are downstream. Consider a crowd, a large crowd, in a confined space, and something goes wrong. A panic begins, and afterward, everyone will tell you what caused it. Someone shouted, someone fell, a door closed. But if you study crowd disasters, and people do study crowd disasters, you find something unsettling. Very often the cause cannot be located. There was no shout. There was no fall. There is simply a moment, identifiable in the footage, where the crowd stops being a collection of people and becomes a single body, and that body moves, and people die. And the crowd was ready before it happened. The density was already critical. The pressure was already there. The tension had already built, distributed across 10,000 bodies, none of whom knew they were carrying it. And then something small occurred, and the crowd did what it was already going to do. The shout did not cause the panic. The panic was already loaded. The shout was just the moment it discharged. Eleanor Hart looks at 7 deviations in 1973 and 800 more in the decades that follow, and she proposes that the field is not seeing the future. The field is showing us the pressure, the wars, the collapses, the moments where a civilization does something terrible and afterward cannot explain why, do not come out of nowhere. They build, they accumulate in 8 billion nervous systems silently, the way charge accumulates in a cloud, and none of us can feel it because we are inside it, the way you cannot feel the weather from inside a raindrop. And when the pressure reaches critical, the discharge occurs, and afterward we go looking for the cause, and we always find one, because there is always something to find. But the cause was not the cause. The cause was us. all of us. The accumulated, unfelt, unacknowledged pressure of an entire species that does not know it is connected, and therefore never checks the gauge. The machines drift before the event because the machines are measuring the pressure, and the pressure comes first. That is what Project Oracle discovered in her reading. Not a weapon, not a channel, a barometer. They built an instrument that could see the emotional weather of the human species approaching a storm front, hours before the storm, and they classified it. Think about why. Not because it was dangerous, because of what it implied about who was in charge. Every institution of power on Earth is built on a foundational assumption, and the assumption is that decisions are made. That somewhere there is a room, and in the room there are people, and the people weigh options and choose, and the choice propagates outward and becomes history. And this instrument suggests something else. It suggests that by the time the room convenes, the pressure is already built, and the decision has already, in some meaningful sense, been made, distributed across 8 billion nervous systems, and the room is not choosing. The room is discharging. The people in the room are the shout in the crowd. They are not the cause. They are the moment it becomes visible. You cannot publish that. You cannot publish that not because it is secret, but because it is unbearable, and because there is nothing whatsoever that anyone could do with it, and because the first thing every institution on Earth would do upon reading it is to try to prove it false, and the second thing they would do is to try to use it. The final document is 9 pages, and Eleanor Hart obtains it in the way that these things always actually happen, which is not through espionage but through a person. An old man, retired, sick, who worked at the facility for 11 years and who does not want to die with it inside him. She meets him in a diner in Nevada, and he does not tell her a story. He simply gives her an envelope and drinks his coffee and says almost nothing, and then he leaves, and she never sees him again. The 9 pages describe a single experiment conducted on a date she recognizes. It was the final test. They powered the array. Thousands of generators, driven, coherent, transmitting into the field at the highest amplitude the facility could sustain, and outside, the 14 chillers screaming into the desert night. And they measured what came back. They expected nothing, or they expected a shift in the global baseline, or they expected some faint echo of their own signal returning to them across the network of listening stations scattered around the world. What they got was a message. I have to be careful how I describe this, because the version that circulates is dramatic and the actual document is not. The document is a technical report. It contains a table. The table describes a structure detected in the return signal, a repeating pattern that persisted across every monitored node on Earth for a period of 4 minutes and 11 seconds, and which cannot be accounted for by any known instrumental artifact. The pattern is mathematical. It is not language. Nobody heard a voice. But the pattern is not random, and the pattern is not the signal they sent, and the pattern repeats. And when you decode the structure of it, using the mapping the researchers themselves proposed in an appendix that is mostly redacted, you get 4 words. You are not separate, that is all. 4 words, repeated 1140 times, and then it stopped, and the noise came back, and the facility went dark, and the program was terminated within the month. Now, here is what I want to say about that, and it is the reason I've told you this whole long story. Ask yourself who sent it. The obvious reading is that something out there answered, that we shouted into the dark and the dark shouted back, and the story becomes a first contact story. And it is a good story, but it is the wrong one. Because there is nothing out there. The field is us. That was the whole premise, from the first page of the first memorandum in 1971. The field is what happens when 8 billion human beings feel the same thing at the same moment. It has no existence apart from us. It is not a place. It is not an entity. It is a condition. It is what we are, when we are together. So when the researchers drove that array to its limit, and pushed a coherent signal into the field and waited, The thing that answered was us, not an alien, not a god, not a machine intelligence lurking in the substrate of reality. Us, speaking to ourselves, through an instrument we built without knowing what we were building, in a language we did not know we could speak, and saying the only thing there was to say. You are not separate, which is not a warning, it is not a threat. It is, when you sit with it, the most obvious statement that could possibly have been made. It is a fact so simple that we needed a 30-year classified program and a room full of screaming chillers in the Nevada desert to tell it to ourselves. We are not separate. We never were. We have simply forgotten, so thoroughly and for so long, that when the truth was finally spoken back to us, it arrived encoded in mathematics from a machine, and we did not recognize the voice, because it was ours. Eleanor Hart never published. She tried. The paper was rejected by 4 journals in terms ranging from polite to contemptuous. She uploaded a preprint, and it was read by a few thousand people and discussed in the sort of forums where such things are discussed, and it was reposted and misquoted and turned into a video with dramatic music and stripped of every qualification she had so carefully built into it. Within a year, the story on the internet was that a scientist had found proof that aliens spoke to us through a computer in Nevada. She stopped correcting it. She is still at her university. She still studies attention and its failures and the small mundane ways in which human perception is unreliable. She has not spoken publicly about any of this in some time. When asked, she says that she does not know what she found, and that she suspects she made a mistake somewhere, and that the human capacity to find meaning in noise is the most powerful force she has ever studied. She says this, and she means it. And then she goes home to a house that is slightly too large, in a town where it rains 8 months of the year, and she reads before bed, and it does not help. The Global Consciousness Project is still running. That part is true. That part is entirely true. As you lie here tonight, in whatever room you are in, there are devices scattered across this planet, in universities and basements and spare rooms, generating streams of numbers that mean nothing at all. They are running right now. They have been running for more than a quarter of a century without pause, through everything. Through every disaster and every celebration, and every ordinary Tuesday when nothing happened anywhere and nobody was watching. Most of that data is noise, almost all of it. A grey river of numbers flowing through servers saying nothing, and occasionally, according to the people who watch it, the river ripples. I do not know if it means anything. I've told you honestly that most scientists say it does not, and I think they are probably right. And I want to leave you with the truth rather than with a thrill. But I want to leave you with something else too, and it is the thing I keep coming back to. The idea at the centre of all this, stripped of the conspiracy and the desert and the classified files, is not a strange idea. It is the oldest idea we have, that we're not as separate as we feel, that the space between us is not empty, that when you lie awake tonight, in the dark, feeling entirely alone with whatever you're carrying, you're participating in something that 8 billion other people are also participating in. Right now, at this moment, most of them also awake, most of them also carrying something, most of them also convinced that they are the only one. Science cannot currently measure that. It may never be able to, but you have felt it. Everyone has felt it. In a crowd, in a church, in a stadium, in a room where terrible news has just arrived. That moment where the boundary softens and you are, for a few seconds, not a person in a room, but a part of a room. We have all felt it. And then the moment passes, and we go back to being separate, because that is what we have been taught, and because a body is a very convincing wall. The machines, if they are measuring anything at all, are measuring the moments when the wall gets thin. That is all. Not aliens, not gods, not a government with its finger on the scale. Just us. Occasionally, briefly, accidentally remembering. Before you drift off tonight, I want to leave you with a thought. If the story we told tonight were true, and I do not believe that it is, then the greatest discovery of the 20th century would not have been that human beings share a collective mind. It would have been that the collective mind was already listening. Long before we built a single machine, long before Princeton, long before the Cold War, long before there was such a thing as a random number, back when we were still in caves, drawing on walls by firelight, before there was a word for lonely. It was already there, already listening, already carrying every one of us. And the only thing that ever changed in all those thousands of years is that we finally, clumsily, with metal boxes and streams of numbers and a great deal of arguing, learned how to listen back. Before we get into tonight's story, a quick thank you to DogFace680 for suggesting this one in the comments. We see every single suggestion, and this one was too good to pass up. If you're listening on Spotify, it would mean the world to us if you took 10 seconds to leave a review. It helps more people find the channel, and if you have a story you want us to cover next, drop it in the comments below. We read them all. Now, settle in. Get comfortable. Because what you're about to hear is not a ghost story. It is not a legend passed down around a campfire. It is a paper trail. It begins in the American Southwest, on high desert mesas that have been inhabited for over 1,000 years. It begins with a people who said they had been watching the sky, the earth, and the patterns of human behaviour for centuries, and that they had seen all of this before. The Hopi people of northern Arizona are among the most historically documented indigenous cultures in North America. Their oral traditions, their ceremonial practices, and their cosmological understanding of cyclical time have been studied by anthropologists since the late 19th century. But there is a chapter of that story that never made it into university textbooks. In classified file rooms within the Department of Defense, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the Department of Energy, analysts spent decades doing something extraordinary. They were not studying the Hopi as a cultural curiosity. They were studying the Hopi prophecies as a potential intelligence asset. Because the numbers were aligning, the symbols were matching, and the timeline, according to internal government memorandums that were never meant to be read by the public, was accelerating. This is the story of what they found. This is the story of what was buried. And this is the story of one man who found the folder they tried to erase. The folder was called Fifth World Transition. You are already in the Fourth World, and if the Hopi elders were right, it is ending. It is 2 months after the Trinity test, July 16th, 1945, the New Mexico desert, a blinding white flash that turned sand into glass, a shock wave that rattled windows 160 miles away. The first nuclear detonation in human history had just occurred, and the men who witnessed it knew immediately that something irreversible had happened. J. Robert Oppenheimer, watching the mushroom cloud rise into the pale morning sky, recalled a verse from Hindu scripture. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Most of official Washington spent the next 2 months focused on military strategy, troop deployments, intelligence assessments, the mechanics of ending a world war. But in September of that same year, in the dusty fieldwork offices of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, a different kind of document was being compiled. 2 anthropologists working in northeastern Arizona had been conducting routine cultural documentation interviews near the ancient village of Aribe, which is widely considered the oldest continuously inhabited settlement in the United States. The interviews had been standard academic work, recording oral traditions, ceremonial calendars, agricultural practices. And then the elders stopped talking, not all at once, not rudely, but with the quiet, deliberate firmness of people who had made a collective decision. The anthropologists noted in their September report that the Hopi elders had agreed to provide no further interviews on matters of prophecy or ceremonial cosmology. The reason given, translated through an interpreter, was recorded almost verbatim in the document. The fire released by man has awakened what sleeps beneath the Fourth World. The anthropologists assumed this was a metaphor, a poetic response to news of the atomic bomb, which had reached even the most remote corners of the American Southwest by late summer. They filed the report. They noted the unusual phrasing. They forwarded the document to the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C., as required by protocol. The document was received. It was logged. And then, instead of being routed to the Cultural Archives division where it belonged, it was redirected. Military intelligence had been quietly monitoring communications tagged with certain keywords since early in the war. The phrase awakened, the phrase beneath, the phrase Fourth World. These had appeared in a handful of indigenous cultural reports over the previous decade, and a small office within the War Department had flagged them for follow-up. The report from Arizona became part of a collection that most historians never knew existed. It was not the last. His name was Frank Waters. He was an American author and researcher born in Colorado Springs at the beginning of the 20th century, and he had spent more of his adult life in the Southwest than anywhere else. He understood the land, he understood the people, and critically, he understood that the oral traditions of cultures like the Hopi were not mythology in the dismissive sense that mainstream academia sometimes used the word. They were records. Waters began formal interviews with Hopi elders around 1945 and continued them for years. He was granted access that most outsiders were not, in part because he approached the work with genuine respect, and in part because the elders, by that period, had made a deliberate decision. They had decided that certain things needed to be said out loud, in a language that could reach beyond the mesa, What Waters documented became the foundation of his landmark book, published in 1963, which provided the most comprehensive written account of Hopi cosmology available in English. The book described a cosmological framework that the Hopi had maintained for generations. Humanity, according to this framework, had not always lived in the world as it exists today. There had been previous worlds, each one a full cycle of human civilization, each one brought to an end not by randomness, not by accident, but by a predictable pattern. The first world had ended by fire, the second by ice, the third by water, a global catastrophe that the elders described in terms that sounded strikingly familiar to flood mythologies found on every continent. And the current world, the fourth world, the one in which all living human beings now reside, was described as being in its final phase. Waters recorded the symbolism carefully. He documented the prophecies as they were shared with him, but there was a layer beneath the published work that he acknowledged privately, in correspondence and in personal notes. Certain teachings had been deliberately withheld from publication at the direct request of the elders who shared them. These were the specific details, the specific timeline, the specific signs. Waters honoured that request, but others had already begun to take notice, because by 1948, the small office within what was now called the Central Intelligence Agency that had been tracking indigenous cultural reports had grown, and the name Frank Waters was on their list. His name was Dan Iwahima. He was a Hopi traditional leader, a keeper of his people's sacred knowledge, and by any reasonable measure one of the most important public voices of the 20th century that most people have never heard of. He was born on the Hopi Mesas in the late 19th century. He grew up in a world that was rapidly being transformed by electricity, by railroads, by the industrial sprawl that was consuming the American landscape, and he watched, with the patience of a man who understood long cycles of time, as each technological development matched descriptions that had been passed down through generations of Hopi knowledge keepers. Throughout the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, Iwahima delivered warnings. He spoke to journalists, to spiritual communities, to activists, to anyone who would listen. His message was consistent. Humanity had entered a period of dangerous technological imbalance. The nuclear weapons that world powers had built and continued to expand represented a fundamental disruption of what he called cosmic harmony. And the signs of world transition, the signs that preceded the shift from one world cycle to the next, had already begun to manifest. He was specific. He described the signs using language that had been preserved for generations. He spoke of a time when the land would be crisscrossed with lines that carried voices over great distances. He spoke of gourds of ashes that would fall from the sky and poison the earth and the water for generations. He spoke of a house that would move through the heavens. He spoke of the wearing of symbols that had once belonged to enemies as if they were one's own, a cryptic reference that some interpreted as the adoption of the swastika, which had been a sacred symbol in many indigenous traditions before it became associated with National Socialism in Europe. He was not considered a threat by most Americans who encountered his message. To mainstream observers, he was an elderly indigenous man speaking in metaphors about ecology and spiritual responsibility, but in certain federal offices his speeches were being transcribed, analysed and filed under a classification level that did not belong in any cultural studies archive. Because what the analysts had noticed was not the general spiritual message, it was the specificity of the timeline. The official record, to the extent that any official record exists, describes it as a radiation monitoring program. In the early 1950s, with Cold War nuclear testing accelerating across the Nevada desert and the Pacific Ocean, the United States Geological Survey deployed a network of ground-based monitoring stations across the Southwest. The public rationale was straightforward. Nuclear tests produced measurable environmental contamination that could drift with wind patterns across the continental interior. It was responsible science to monitor the spread. The stations near northeastern Arizona were logged as part of this network. Their coordinates were recorded. Their data feeds were established. and teams of personnel were dispatched to install and maintain the equipment. What the official record does not explain, what cannot be explained by radiation monitoring alone, is why the coordinates of those specific stations cluster so precisely around the Hopi mesas. A researcher named Sandra Kellerman, working independently in the early 1990s on a Freedom of Information Act project related to Cold War environmental monitoring, noticed the cluster pattern and submitted a formal inquiry. She was told the placement was determined by prevailing wind modelling from the Nevada test site. The explanation was technically plausible. It was also, as Kellerman later noted in a paper that was quietly declined by 3 separate academic journals before being published in a small independent newsletter, mathematically inconsistent with the wind modelling data that had been declassified from the same period. The stations were not placed to monitor where the wind went. They were placed to monitor specific geographic zones that appeared again and again in the Hopi prophetic traditions as sites of cosmic significance. And the data those stations collected was not consistent with simple radiation monitoring. The instruments were recording 2 things that had no immediate explanation. First, subsurface vibration anomalies. Low-frequency seismic activity occurring at irregular intervals, too shallow to be tectonic movement of the type common in the region, too deep to be surface disturbance from weather or human activity. Second, magnetic fluctuations, unlike anything observed in the surrounding desert geology. The Colorado Plateau has a distinctive magnetic signature. These readings were deviating from that signature in ways that the personnel who processed the data flagged repeatedly for additional review. The program was given an internal code name. The name was later said to refer to solar radiation tracking. But the files that were eventually found, in a server room that was not supposed to exist anymore, told a different story. The document is a single internal memorandum, 12 pages, typed on a government-issue typewriter, with certain passages underlined in red ink that suggests a senior reviewer went through it carefully. The date is listed as March of 1957, and the classification marking at the top reads in a designation that, when cross-referenced with intelligence community classification systems of the period, corresponds to a level above top secret. The memorandum was produced by an analytical unit whose formal title has never been publicly identified. The authors referred to their work internally as a comparative symbolic analysis. What they had done, over the course of several years, was systematically cross-reference documented Hopi prophecy symbolism with observable events in post-war American and global technological development. The results of that cross-reference were, by any conservative academic standard, remarkable. The prophecies described, in language preserved across generations, a series of developments that would signal the final phase of the Fourth World. And when the analysts laid those descriptions next to the technological trajectory of the mid-20th century, the alignment was not vague. It was not the kind of a loose metaphorical connection that can be retrofitted onto almost any event. It was, in the language of the memorandum itself, statistically improbable as coincidence. The first comparison involved what the prophecies described as a great spider web stretched across the land, connecting distant places and carrying voices and thoughts instantaneously from one end of the world to the other. The analysts noted the obvious correspondence to the telecommunications infrastructure that had been expanding across North America since the late 19th century, and had, by the 1950s, created precisely the kind of interconnected communication grid that the metaphor described. The second comparison involved the prophecy's warning of gourds of ashes that would fall from the sky and destroy great areas of land, poisoning the earth and the water for generations. The analysts noted the direct correspondence to nuclear fallout, including the specific detail about multi-generational contamination that was consistent with what scientists had learned about radioactive isotope persistence since 1945. The third comparison involved a description of a house in the sky that would move among the stars, carrying human beings beyond the atmosphere of the Earth. The analysts noted that, at the time the memorandum was written in 1957, Sputnik had been launched into orbit just months earlier. The memorandum concluded with a sentence that was underlined twice by whoever reviewed it. Prophecy descriptions demonstrate statistically significant alignment with post-industrial technological developments. Recommend continued monitoring and expanded cultural intelligence collection. Classification to remain at current level pending further analysis. It was filed, it was reviewed, and the program quietly expanded its mandate. By the early 1960s, the United States was engaged in the most intensive period of nuclear weapons development in its history. Underground tests at the Nevada test site were occurring with a frequency that created a near-constant low-level seismic tremor across the Great Basin. Above-ground tests in the Pacific sent radioactive clouds drifting eastward. The Earth itself was being subjected to energies and pressures that had not existed in geological memory. On the Hopi mesas, the elders were conducting ceremonies that outsiders rarely witnessed. These ceremonies were not theatrical performances. They were, in the Hopi understanding, functional. They were acts of spiritual maintenance, practical work performed to sustain the relationship between human beings and the living earth. And in this period, the ceremonies carried an urgency that long-time observers noted was unusual. The elders were describing an imbalance, not a future imbalance, a present one, an active disruption in the relationship between human technological activity and the geological and cosmic systems that the Hopi cosmology understood as interconnected. Simultaneously, something was happening underground. The Department of Defense, working through front contracts with civilian geological survey companies, had installed a network of remote seismic monitoring stations across northeastern Arizona, southern Utah, and northwestern New Mexico, the Four Corners region. The network was described in its administrative documents as a National Seismic Safety Research Program. The data it was collecting told a different story. Beginning in approximately 1962, and continuing through the decade, the monitoring stations were recording repeated low-frequency pulses originating from deep beneath the Colorado Plateau. Deep, far deeper than the surface vibrations that Nevada test site detonations could explain. These pulses had a periodicity, a regularity, that was inconsistent with the random, irregular pattern of seismic activity caused by nuclear tests or tectonic movement. They were rhythmic. The technicians who processed the data flagged the anomaly in every quarterly report. Senior analysts reviewed those flags. The data was transmitted to a specialized unit that did not appear on any published organizational chart of the Department of Defense. And in classified internal communications from this period, a phrase appears for the first time that would reappear in documents across the next 3 decades: pre-transition activity. No one in the unclassified record has ever defined what transition was being referenced. Among the many elements of Hopi prophetic tradition, one stands out as both the most dramatic and the most specific. It is the prediction of the blue star Kachina. In the Hopi ceremonial calendar, Kachinas are spiritual entities that embody the forces of nature, the spirits of the ancestors, and the cosmic principles that govern life on Earth. There are hundreds of Kachinas in the Hopi tradition, each with specific characteristics, specific appearances, and specific roles in the ceremonial and cosmic order. The blue star Kachina is different. It is not a figure of the established ceremonial order. It is a prophetic figure, one that appears not in regular ceremony but in prophecy. And the prophecy is specific. At some point during the final phase of the Fourth World, a blue star will appear in the sky. Its appearance will mark a critical threshold in the transition between worlds. In the late 1960s, a small unit within the Air Force's Astronomical Monitoring Division began tracking something unusual. The unit had access to optical and radio telescope data from a network of observatories that had been collecting information since the early years of the space program. In reviewing that data, analysts identified periodic reports of an unusual celestial object, not a known comet, not a classified satellite, not any catalogued body in the conventional astronomical record, that appeared to be following an irregular orbital path through the inner solar system. The object had a distinctive spectral signature. Under certain observational conditions, at certain points in its orbit, it emitted light in the blue-violet range of the visible spectrum. The unit began a quiet, informal program of tracking this object. They gave it a nickname that they used only in the internal communications, never in formal reports. They called it Blue Star Watch. Formal astronomical designation was never assigned in any document that has entered the public record. The program continued for years, quietly, carefully, with observations logged in a restricted access database that was maintained separately from the standard astronomical catalogues that circulated among civilian scientists. And every time the object completed a pass through the inner solar system, appearing briefly as a faint blue-tinted light in the night sky, before disappearing back into the outer reaches of the solar neighbourhood, the restricted database was updated, and the classified file cross-referenced with the Hopi Prophecy Archive was updated as well. The date was December 10th, 1992. The venue was the United Nations General Assembly Hall in New York City. The occasion was the International Year of the World's Indigenous People. An elderly Hopi man named Thomas Banyasia stood at the podium and delivered a speech that, by any objective account of its content, should have been the most widely discussed address of that decade. Banyasia had been designated by Hopi traditional leaders in 1948, at almost the exact same time that Frank Waters was conducting his interviews near Oribe, as an official messenger to the outside world. His mandate was specific, to deliver the Hopi warning to the leaders of the nations of the world, particularly to what the elders called the House of Mika, the structure they believed had been built specifically to receive that warning. The House of Mika was the United Nations building in New York City. The elders had described it in prophetic terms generations before it was constructed, referring to a great house with walls like glass and crystal that would be built on the eastern shore of the continent, where the representatives of all the world's nations would gather to discuss the fate of humanity. Banyasia had tried to deliver the message to the United Nations for over 40 years. He had been refused, delayed, and redirected by bureaucratic processes that he navigated with the patience of a man who understood long-time horizons. He finally addressed the General Assembly in 1992, at the age of 86. His speech was measured, careful, specific. He described the Hopi understanding of the cycles of worlds. He described the signs that had been observed. He described the trajectory he believed humanity was on. He asked the nations of the world to change their relationship with the earth before a change was imposed upon them by forces larger than any government could manage. He was followed, in the formal program, by another speaker. The hall moved on. But what the formal diplomatic record does not reflect, what appears only in cables and memoranda that were classified at the national security level, is the level of institutional attention that Banyasia's address received from intelligence agencies. Analysts from multiple organisations were present in the General Assembly Hall on December 10th, 1992. Not in official capacities, not with credentials that identified their institutional affiliations, but present, with observers' access, listening and taking notes. The briefing document prepared in the weeks following the speech was labelled Indigenous Predictive Framework Analysis. It was not filed in a cultural studies archive. It was filed with the collection that had been growing quietly since September of 1945. By the late 1990s, the science of climate modelling had advanced to the point where long-range projections were becoming both technically feasible and institutionally important. Agencies across the federal government were running models. The scenarios varied, the parameters differed, but the trajectory that emerged from model after model was consistent enough to prompt serious internal discussion about what the long-term environmental future of the planet might look like. A team of climate scientists working within a federal research program made an unexpected discovery in the course of their modelling work. They had been given access, under a classified research directive, to the cultural intelligence archive that had been accumulating since the 1940s. The access was framed as a methodology experiment. Could traditional ecological knowledge contained in indigenous oral traditions provide useful baseline data for long-range environmental modelling? The team was sceptical. professionally sceptical, in the way that scientists trained in quantitative methods tend to be when asked to engage with material that lacks the methodological rigour of peer-reviewed research. The scepticism lasted approximately 3 weeks into the analysis. What the team found when they mapped the Hopi prophetic timeline against the long-range climate projections they had developed independently was not a loose correlation. It was not the kind of ambiguous overlap that could be dismissed as confirmation bias. The Hopi symbolic timeline, as documented in the Cultural Intelligence Archive, described a series of environmental and social developments that corresponded with striking precision to the projected tipping points their own models had identified for the period between approximately 2000 and 2050. The internal memorandum summarising the finding used careful, measured scientific language. It avoided any framing that would invite accusations of mysticism or credulous interpretation. It proposed a specific alternative hypothesis. The Hopi prophecies were not supernatural predictions. They were cultural memory. They were the preserved observational record of a civilization that had lived through previous periods of catastrophic environmental and social instability, not in legend, but in reality, and had encoded the pattern of that instability in narrative form precise enough to survive thousands of years of oral transmission. The civilizations that had lived through the previous cycles had understood what was coming. They had tried to communicate the pattern forward across time, and they had succeeded well enough that analysts working with 21st century computational tools were now reading the pattern and finding it accurate. The memorandum was classified, it was added to the archive, and the archive's classification level was upgraded. His name, or at least the name he used in the independent security research community, was Lucas Hale. He was 29 years old in 2006, working freelance contract cybersecurity work for small technology firms, while pursuing the kind of independent research that occupied the grey areas between legitimate penetration testing and the informal culture of internet archaeology that had become a significant subculture in the early years of the 21st century. He was not a political person. He was not motivated by ideology or by a specific grievance against any institution. He was motivated by the thing that drives a particular category of technically gifted, intellectually restless individuals, the conviction that interesting things exist in places where you're not supposed to look. He had been working for several months on a project that had begun almost accidentally. A Department of Energy server address had appeared in a dataset he was analysing for a client, and when he investigated the address, he discovered that it corresponded to a physical machine that the Department of Energy's network documentation listed as decommissioned in 2001. Decommissioned systems are supposed to be wiped, physically disconnected and rendered inaccessible. This one was not. It was still connected, it was still running, and its access credentials had not been rotated since before its supposed decommissioning. Lucas Hale spent 3 weeks carefully, methodically working his way into the system. He was not reckless. He documented every step. He maintained extensive logs. He was, by his own account in later communications shared with a small group of trusted contacts, deeply uncertain about whether he should be doing what he was doing, but he kept going. The server contained a directory structure that was largely empty. Years of routine file operations producing an archaeological record of what had once been stored there, and subsequently removed. But not everything had been removed. In the directory structure, nested several levels below the root in a path that suggested it had been placed there deliberately by someone who wanted it to survive routine cleanup sweeps, was a folder. The folder was named Fifth World Transition. Inside the folder were 412 files. Some were text documents. Some were data files with formats that required specialised software to read. Some were image scans of what appeared to be physical documents. Pages of typed text, handwritten margin notes, government letterhead with classification markings at the top and bottom of every page. Lucas Hale began reading. He read for 3 days straight, stopping only to sleep in short intervals and to eat whatever was within reach of his workspace. By the end of the 3rd day, he had a preliminary understanding of what he was looking at, and he understood why it had been buried. Among the 412 files in the folder, one document stood apart from the others. Not because of its length. It was actually one of the shorter documents in the collection, running to just under 20 pages of typed text. Not because of its date, though the date, April 17th, 1971, was significant. It stood apart because of what it was. The other documents in the folder were analytical. They were reports, memoranda, data summaries, academic-style analyses. They were the products of observation and interpretation. They described. This document prescribed. Its title, typed in capitals across the top of the first page beneath a classification marking that Lucas Hale recognised from his research as a designation reserved for material with national security implications at the highest level, was the World Transition Contingency Plan. The document had 4 primary objectives, stated explicitly in the opening section. Objective 1. Preserve governmental continuity through a potential period of significant social disruption, resulting from environmental, geological or cosmic events, consistent with the timeline identified in the Cultural Intelligence Archive. Objective 2. Identify and protect the geographic locations designated as significant in the indigenous prophetic traditions that had been under study, on the hypothesis that these locations might represent areas of geological or ecological stability during transition events. Objective 3. Prevent public panic that might result from widespread knowledge of the prophetic timeline and its correspondence to observable developments. Objective 4. Maintain ongoing monitoring of all identified variables, astronomical, geological, biological, social, to provide maximum lead time for governmental response to transition event initiation. The document was bureaucratic in its language. It was measured. It was written in the style of professionals trained to approach extraordinary situations with procedural normalcy. But the implication beneath the language was impossible to misread. The people who wrote this document believed that a transition event was real. They believed it was coming. They believed they understood, at least partially, what it would involve. And they had spent the better part of a decade building a planning framework for surviving it. Lucas Hale sat back from his screen. He had been a skeptic about most things his entire life. It was, professionally and temperamentally, his default mode. But sitting in his apartment in the early hours of a morning in 2006, reading a classified government contingency plan for the transition between world cycles, described in an ancient indigenous prophecy, he found that his skepticism had nowhere to go. The document was real, the archive was real, and the people who had compiled it were not mystics or cranks. They were career government analysts, military planners, climate scientists. They were, by every professional measure, exactly the kind of people whose assessments you would trust. They had looked at the evidence, and they had concluded that it was worth planning for. In Hopi cosmology, the transition between worlds does not happen abstractly. It happens through a specific geographic feature. The Sipapu, the emergence point, is the physical location through which the survivors of the previous world emerged into the current one, and through which the transition to the next world will be initiated. The Hopi locate the Sipapu in the Grand Canyon near the confluence of the Colorado River and the Little Colorado River. The specific location is sacred. It is not a tourist attraction. It is not publicly accessible. It is a place that Hopi traditional leaders have maintained as a ceremonial site for as long as their oral tradition records. When Lucas Hale began mapping the geographic data contained in the folder against publicly available records of federal land restrictions and protected zones, he expected to find some overlap. He expected the monitoring program to have focused on the areas around the Hopi mesas themselves, which were the most obvious locations documented in the Cultural Intelligence Archive. What he found instead was a pattern that he described to his contacts as the most clarifying thing he had encountered in 3 days of reading classified documents. The federal land restrictions, some established through standard national park and monument designations, some through military exclusion zones, some through a category of restricted area that does not appear in any public land management registry, formed a ring. A complete ring, if you traced it on a map, around the Hopi Mesas and the Colorado Plateau region. The ring was not uniform. It had gaps. It had areas where the restrictions were lighter and areas where the restrictions were absolute. But as a geographic pattern, it was unmistakable. And the centre of the ring, the point equidistant from the restricted zones on all sides, corresponded almost exactly to the location of the Sipapoo. There was more. In the satellite data that had been included in the archive, data from geological survey satellites that had been imaging the Colorado Plateau since the early days of the space program, there were readings that the standard geological explanations did not fully account for. Deep beneath the Colorado Plateau, seismic imaging had revealed what the technical reports described as an anomalous chamber structure, not a cave system, not a natural geological void of the kind that the karst topography of the region commonly produced. Something deeper, something with geometric regularities that natural geological processes do not typically produce. The government geologists who had written the technical reports had not attributed the anomaly to supernatural causes. They had proposed several conventional explanations and noted that none of them fully accounted for the data. They had also noted in a single sentence at the end of one report that the location of the anomaly corresponded to the geographic coordinates of the Sipapoo as documented in the Cultural Intelligence Archive. They had not drawn a conclusion from that correspondence, but they had noted it. On a Tuesday morning in the late summer of 2008, monitoring stations across northern Arizona and southern Utah recorded a sequence of events that lasted approximately 14 minutes. The sequence began with a sudden, sharp increase in localized magnetic field intensity across a zone of approximately 80 miles in diameter, centered on the Colorado Plateau. The increase was not gradual. It was not the kind of slow variation that magnetic monitoring stations typically recorded over hours or days. It was sudden, a jump in the data from baseline readings to elevated readings that occurred within a single measurement interval. Simultaneously, instruments measuring atmospheric ionization, the density of electrically charged particles in the air, recorded a spike across the same geographic zone. The spike was brief. It lasted less than 3 minutes by the time it was captured across the full network of monitoring stations. But its intensity was, in the words of the technical report that was later produced, outside the range of any previously recorded natural ionization event in the region. And for a period of approximately 11 minutes during the peak of the magnetic and ionization anomaly, communication systems across northern Arizona experienced interruptions. Radio signals were affected. Cellular networks experienced outages in areas where infrastructure was functioning normally before and after. The official explanation, released in a brief public notice issued by the Federal Aviation Administration because aviation communications had been briefly affected, was solar interference, a geomagnetic disturbance associated with solar activity. The explanation was plausible. Solar weather events do cause exactly the kinds of effects that were recorded on that Tuesday morning. What the public explanation did not address, what the restricted internal memorandum produced by the monitoring network's senior analysts addressed directly, was the geographic specificity of the event. Solar weather events affect large areas. They affect hemispheric regions. They do not typically produce effects concentrated in an 80-mile diameter circle centered on a specific location in the American Southwest. The internal memorandum used a specific phrase in its concluding assessment. Event characteristics consistent with pre-transition fluctuation. Recommend elevated monitoring posture and cross-reference with Blue Star Watch astronomical data. By the time Lucas Hale had worked his way through the later documents in the archive, the ones produced in the 1990s and 2000s, after the climate modelling findings and the continued accumulation of geological, astronomical and social data, he had encountered a shift in the way the analysts framed their conclusions. In the early documents, from the 1940s through the 1960s, the framing was cautious. The prophecies were treated as a data source of uncertain reliability that might contain useful information. The analysts were careful to maintain professional distance from the content, noting correlations without asserting causation, flagging anomalies without proposing mechanisms. But in the later documents, that distance had narrowed. The analysts had arrived, through decades of accumulated evidence, at a position that was carefully stated but unmistakable in its implications. They no longer believed the Hopi prophecies were describing destruction in the catastrophic civilizational collapse sense that the word apocalypse typically implies. The word that appeared with increasing frequency in the later documents was transition. The fifth world in the analyst's revised framework was not a world after annihilation. It was a world after a threshold. The first interpretation the analysts explored was environmental, a major global environmental reset, a period of rapid ecological change severe enough to fundamentally alter the conditions of human civilization as it currently exists, followed by a stabilization into a different kind of equilibrium. The second interpretation was cosmological, a solar cycle instability event of a type that has occurred multiple times in the geological record, producing a combination of climatic, magnetic and atmospheric effects that would be, by modern civilizational standards, catastrophic in their disruption, but not in their permanence. The third interpretation was geological, a planetary magnetic shift, a reversal or excursion of the Earth's magnetic field, which the geological record confirmed had occurred multiple times in the planet's history, and which would, if it occurred in the modern era, affect every electronic, navigational and communication system on the planet, while also producing biological effects that were poorly understood. The fourth interpretation was the one that the analysts approached most carefully, and that several of them explicitly declined to address in formal documents, noting that it fell outside their analytical remit. It was the possibility that the transition the Hopi prophecy described was not primarily physical, that it was, in some sense, that the analytical frameworks available to government researchers were not equipped to evaluate a transition in human consciousness itself, a shift in the fundamental relationship between human awareness and the world it inhabits. The analysts who raised this possibility and then declined to pursue it were not mystics. They were professionals who had spent years immersed in data that kept pointing in a direction their training told them could not be the correct direction. But the data kept pointing there, so they noted it, they flagged it, they declined to conclude, and they kept monitoring. Across the years of Blue Star Watch observations, the astronomical unit had accumulated data spanning decades. They had tracked the object's appearances in the inner solar system. They had measured its orbital characteristics as precisely as the observational tools available to them allowed, and they had, over time, constructed a model of its behaviour that allowed them to make projections. The projections were not precise in the way that standard astronomical calculations of known orbital bodies are precise. The object's path was irregular in ways that suggested it was subject to gravitational influences that the model did not fully account for. But the broad strokes of its orbital cycle were clear enough to estimate. The object returned to the inner solar system on a long cycle. The analysts estimated the cycle at between 3,000 and 4,000 years, with significant uncertainty in both directions. But across the decades of observation they had accumulated, they were confident in one thing: the object was returning. Its most recent observable appearance had placed it at the far edge of detectable range. The next closest approach, based on the best available orbital modelling, was projected to occur somewhere in the mid-21st century. The document in the archive that recorded this projection was dated 2002, and at the end of the technical summary there was a note, informal, clearly added after the main analysis was complete, that read simply, "The Blue Star Kachina approaches. Time uncertain. Direction confirmed." At the bottom of the directory, after the cultural intelligence reports and the satellite observation logs, and the restricted anthropology transcripts and the climate modelling memoranda and the contingency planning documents, Lucas Hale found a single file that was different from all the others. It was encrypted, not with the standard encryption protocols that the other restricted documents used. This file used a different protocol, a more recent one that suggested it had been encrypted or re-encrypted long after the other files in the archive were created. It took Lucas Hale 11 days to open it. He was by that point aware that he had been spending more time than was wise on a system he had no legal right to access. He was also aware that the material he had found was not the kind of thing that could be simply dismissed or ignored. He was in the position of the person who, having opened a door they were not supposed to open, cannot pretend they did not see what was on the other side. The final file was a briefing document. It was the most recently dated document in the entire archive, listed as prepared in 1998, though it referenced material from the full span of the archive's history, suggesting it had been written as a comprehensive summary rather than a contemporaneous record. Its subject was the fundamental question that the archive had been circling for 50 years without directly stating. The question was, what does it mean that an ancient indigenous culture accurately described developments that took place centuries or millennia after the traditions were established? The analyst's final answer, their considered, carefully constructed, professionally responsible answer, occupied 3 paragraphs of the briefing document. Lucas Hale read them several times. The first paragraph noted that the accumulated evidence did not support a supernatural explanation, and that the analytical team was not proposing one. The second paragraph proposed the alternative that the climate modelling team had suggested years earlier, now expanded and supported by the full weight of the archive's accumulated findings, that indigenous knowledge systems like the Hopi tradition represented preserved observational science of extraordinary depth, developed by civilizations that had experienced and survived previous cycles of catastrophic change, and had encoded the pattern of those cycles in narrative and ceremonial form precise enough to survive thousands of years of oral transmission. The third paragraph was the one that stopped Lucas Hale. It read, in its entirety, as follows. The most significant implication of the evidence reviewed in this analysis is not that the Hopi prophetic tradition accurately describes future events. It is that in order to do so with the precision documented in this archive, the tradition must have preserved observational records from prior civilizational cycles that modern science has not yet identified. The conclusion, if the evidence is accepted, is that the cycle described in the Fourth World to Fifth World transition framework has occurred before. That human civilization, or something that can reasonably be called human civilization, survived it before, and that the survival of whatever comes next was the purpose for which the knowledge was preserved. Lucas Hale closed his laptop. He sat in his apartment in the dark for a long time. Then he made copies of everything, distributed them across locations he trusted, and began to plan a trip to Arizona. He drove through the night. Highway 89 through the Navajo Nation, the land opening up around him into the vast, dark, empty expanse of the Colorado Plateau. The sky above was extraordinary. No light pollution for 100 miles in any direction. The stars so dense and so present that they felt close enough to touch. He had not told anyone where he was going. He was not sure what he expected to find. He had spent weeks reading documents that described this landscape in the language of geological anomaly and classified monitoring programs and prophetic significance. He wanted to see it as what it actually was. He arrived at the base of the Hopi mesas before the sun came up. He parked on the shoulder of the state highway and got out of the car. The air was cold and dry and absolutely still. The mesas rose above him, dark against the pre-dawn sky, massive and ancient and profoundly indifferent to the concerns of any individual human being. He had been told by someone in his network who had spent time in the region that the dawn ceremony, if one was being performed, would begin when the first light appeared on the eastern horizon. He was not invited to the ceremony. He was not on Hopi land. He was standing on the highway at the base of the mesa, which was as close as he was going to get, and that was fine. He watched the horizon begin to lighten, slowly at first, the faintest suggestion of grey in the east, barely distinguishable from the darkness. Then the grey deepened and spread, and the stars at the eastern edge of the sky began to fade, and the shapes of the mesas became clearer, and the desert floor around him began to emerge from the darkness in shades of rust and ochre and pale sand. Somewhere above him, on the mesa, the ceremony was happening. He could not see it. He could not hear it. but he knew it was happening because it had been happening at every dawn ceremony since before his great-grandmother's great-grandmother was born, and there was no reason to believe it was not happening now. The sun broke the horizon. It came up fast, the way it does in the desert, without the soft diffusion of humidity that makes sunrise gradual in other places. One moment the horizon was dark. The next moment the top edge of the sun was there, fierce and immediate, and the whole landscape flooded with warm gold light, and the shadows of the mesas stretched westward across the desert floor, like long dark fingers pointing towards something. Lucas Hale stood on the highway shoulder and watched the sunrise. He thought about the files, about the analysts who had spent their careers trying to understand what they were looking at, about the elders who had carried the knowledge forward across centuries and millennia, about the specific, precise, improbable accuracy of what had been preserved and what had been found. He thought about the word transition, not destruction, not apocalypse, not the end of everything. Transition, the movement from one state to another, the crossing of a threshold that exists not because someone built it there, but because the natural cycles of the earth and the cosmos and the patterns of human civilization make it inevitable. Not a punishment, not a judgment, just the next thing. The sun continued to rise. The desert got warmer. Birds appeared, calling to each other across the scrub. Lucas Hale got back in his car. He had a long drive ahead of him. The archive, if it exists, and the evidence suggests it does, represents one of the more extraordinary examples of what intelligence agencies call long-term pattern analysis. Decades of work by serious credentialed professionals following a thread of evidence wherever it led. What they found, by the end, was not what they expected to find when the first flagged report landed on a government desk in September of 1945. They expected at most to document a cultural curiosity that might have marginal intelligence value. They found instead something that resisted every conventional explanatory framework they brought to it. The Hopi people had preserved, across an unbroken chain of oral transmission, spanning a duration that modern historians prefer not to estimate too precisely, a detailed and accurate account of a pattern that the most sophisticated analytical tools available to the most powerful government on earth were still struggling to fully understand. They had not preserved it for the government. They had not preserved it for researchers or analysts or independent cybersecurity professionals who stumbled across abandoned servers. They had preserved it for the same reason they had always preserved it, because they understood, in a way that modern civilization is still learning to understand, that the pattern matters more than any individual cycle within the pattern. The fourth world is ending. It has been ending, if the Hopi framework is correct, since at least 1945, when the fire that awakened what sleeps beneath was released into the world for the first time. The fifth world will begin. Not with catastrophe, not with spectacle, not with any single dramatic event that can be pointed to and said, there, that is the moment, with recognition. The recognition that the knowledge was always there, that the warning was given, that the pattern was preserved, and that the people who carried it forward across mountains of time, across cycles of civilization that left no trace in any textbook, across the long silence of centuries during which the people who held the knowledge were dismissed and marginalized and overlooked, those people were right. They were always right. And somewhere on a high desert mesa in northern Arizona, as the sun rises over the same landscape it has risen over, for longer than any living memory can reach, a ceremony continues, as it always has, as it always will, until the transition is complete, until the fifth world begins. There is one more thread worth following before we close. The solar micronova hypothesis, developed by independent researchers working outside mainstream academic institutions and drawing on a growing body of geological and ice core evidence, proposes that the sun undergoes periodic episodes of elevated energetic output that are orders of magnitude more intense than the solar activity measured in modern observational records. These episodes, according to the hypothesis, occur on cycles of approximately 12,000 years. They produce, in a compressed time frame, the kind of climatic, magnetic and atmospheric disruption that the geological record shows occurring repeatedly across the Pleistocene and Holocene epochs. They are consistent with the flood myths, the skyfire narratives, and the civilization-ending events that appear in oral traditions on every continent. The Hopi framework of world cycles, each ending in a different kind of catastrophe, maps with reasonable precision onto the kinds of events a solar micronova would produce. The first world ending in fire could describe a period of intense solar energetic output. The second world ending in ice could describe the rapid cooling that would follow the disruption of ocean circulation systems in the aftermath of a major solar event. The third world ending in water could describe the coastal inundation that would follow the rapid melting of ice sheets destabilised by a combination of solar heating and magnetic disturbance. The analysts who worked on the archive do not appear to have had access to the specific solar micronova research, which was not developed until decades after the early classified work was done. But the climate modelling documents from the late 1990s discuss solar cycle instability in terms that, read in the context of what has since been proposed, suggest the researchers were approaching the same territory from a different direction. The thread, if followed, leads to the same place the Hopi prophecy leads: a cycle, a threshold, a transition, and a question that no current scientific or governmental framework has fully answered. Is the current period of global environmental instability a consequence of human industrial activity alone, or is it also being driven by something larger, something that operates on timescales that dwarf the entire recorded history of human civilization? And perhaps most striking of all is this: the Hopi prophecy is not alone. The pattern it describes, world cycles, a current world nearing its end, signs of transition in the natural and human world, a coming period of disruption followed by a new phase of existence, appears in the traditional knowledge systems of cultures on every continent. The Maya long count calendar describes a similar cyclical framework. The Hindu tradition describes 4 world ages called yugas, each with specific characteristics and each followed by the next. The current age is described as the most materially focused and spiritually attenuated of the 4, and its conclusion is described in terms that correspond, in broad strokes, to the kinds of events the archive documents. Norse mythology describes Ragnarok not simply as a battle of gods, but as a cosmic reset followed by a new world emerging from the ocean, green and renewed, populated by survivors who had preserved the seeds of knowledge and culture through the transition. Aboriginal Australian traditions describe the Dreamtime not as a historical past, but as a living framework through which the patterns of existence, including transitions between phases, can be accessed and understood. These traditions, developed independently in widely separated cultures, might represent independent observations of the same underlying pattern. If the pattern is real, if the cycle of world transitions is a genuine feature of the relationship between human civilization, planetary dynamics, and astronomical cycles, then multiple cultures might have observed it, each through their own frameworks of understanding, each encoding it in their own cultural language. What would that mean? It would mean that the warning is not just Hopi. It is universal. It has been given in every language spoken by human beings, in every culture that survived long enough to develop the frameworks necessary to recognize the pattern. And it has been given specifically to us, to the civilization that currently occupies the 4th world, to the people listening to these words in the particular way that people in this particular historical moment listen to things. The warning has been given. Whether it is heard is, and always has been, the only question that matters. Good night, wherever in the world you are listening from. Sleep well, and remember, the knowledge was always there. There is something else worth considering, something the analysts touched on but never fully explored in the documents Lucas Hale recovered. The question of who built the archive in the first place, and more precisely, who made the decision that it needed to be built at all. Every bureaucratic structure has an origin point. Every classified program began with a specific request, a specific authorization, a specific individual or group of individuals who decided that resources should be directed toward a particular problem. The Cultural Intelligence Archive that became the Fifth World Collection did not grow organically. It was not the result of independent researchers working in parallel, accidentally arriving at the same conclusions and eventually connecting their findings. It was a directed program. Someone at some point in the years immediately following the Trinity test made a deliberate decision that the Hopi prophetic tradition was worth investigating at a classified level, that the resources of military intelligence should be applied to the study of an indigenous cosmological framework, that this work should be conducted quietly, outside the normal channels of academic or governmental transparency, and that its findings should be restricted to an audience that could not include the general public. That decision was not the kind of decision that gets made casually, not in the bureaucratic culture of mid-20th century American intelligence. Such a decision required justification. It required someone to make a case, in language that would be persuasive to the kind of skeptical, pragmatic military and intelligence officials who controlled resources in that environment. It required someone to explain why this particular body of indigenous tradition, among all the indigenous traditions that existed across the continent, deserved classified analytical attention. The September 1945 report from the Bureau of Indian Affairs may have been the trigger. But triggers alone do not create programs. Triggers create attention. Programs require sustained institutional will. And somewhere in the gap between the September report and the fully operational monitoring network that was in place by the early 1950s, something happened. Some conversation was had. Some briefing was given. Some assessment was made by people with the authority to commit resources. That conversation, that briefing, that assessment, none of it has ever entered the public record. The earliest document in the Fifth World Archive that Lucas Hale found was dated 1952. The 7 years between September 1945 and 1952 represent a gap in the record that may simply reflect the fact that earlier documents were not preserved in the particular server that Hale accessed, or it may reflect something else, the deliberate removal of the earliest, most sensitive material from a collection that was already highly classified. The question of what was in those missing 7 years, what conversations happened, what decisions were made, what evidence prompted the commitment of resources, may never be answered. But the fact that the program existed at all is itself the answer to the most fundamental question. Someone in a position of institutional authority, in the years immediately following the first use of nuclear weapons, took the Hopi prophecy seriously enough to build a classified monitoring program around it, not a study group, not an academic grant, a classified monitoring program with field stations and satellite data and interdisciplinary analytical teams and a physical infrastructure that persisted, in one form or another, for more than 50 years. That is not what you do with something you dismiss. That is what you do with something you believe might be real. The Hopi word for the emergence point between worlds is also used in everyday language to refer to the navel, the physical location on the human body that marks the point of original connection, the place where the cord of life was attached. The analogy is not accidental. In Hopi cosmology, the Sipapu is the navel of the world, in the same way that the human navel is the mark of original emergence. It is the place where the world was fed, where it was sustained, where it was connected to something larger and older than itself, and it is the place through which the next phase of existence will be born. The Hopi do not describe the transition between worlds as death. They describe it as birth. The fourth world does not end the way a flame is extinguished, suddenly, completely, with nothing remaining. It ends the way one stage of development ends and another begins, the way an egg opens, the way a seed cracks. The world that emerges is not the world that preceded it, but it is not unconnected to it either. It carries forward what was preserved. It begins with the knowledge that the people who survived chose to bring through the passage. This is what the government analysts ultimately concluded in the careful language of the final briefing document. Not that the world was ending. Not that civilization was doomed, but that a threshold existed, and that the Hopi had been describing that threshold for generations, and that the threshold was approaching, and that the question of what came through it, what knowledge, what values, what understanding of the relationship between human beings and the world they inhabit, was the most important question any civilization had ever faced. They were bureaucrats, they were analysts, they were people trained to process information and produce assessments and file reports and attend meetings and move up the institutional hierarchies of the organizations they served. They were not philosophers or spiritual leaders or visionaries, and yet, at the end of 50 years of patient, classified, quietly extraordinary work, they had arrived at the same place that the Hopi elders had been standing all along. The transition is not something that happens to you. It is something you participate in. The choice of what to bring through, what to preserve, what to protect, what to hold on to as everything familiar becomes unfamiliar. That choice belongs to the people living in the final years of the Fourth World. To every person who has ever heard this story and felt somewhere beneath the skepticism that modern life instills in all of us, that it resonated with something they already knew, something older than memory, something that has been trying, across all the centuries of human civilization, to be remembered. The Hopi have a phrase that translates roughly as walking the road of life with proper attention. It means something specific in the context of their cosmology. It means understanding that you're not simply an individual navigating a personal existence. You're a link in a chain that extends backward through the previous worlds and forward into the next one. What you do with your portion of the pattern matters, not in the grandiose sense of history-making or world-changing, in the quiet, daily, cumulative sense of whether the knowledge you carry is honoured or abandoned, whether the warnings you have been given are heard or dismissed, whether the thread of continuity that has been maintained against extraordinary odds across cycles of civilization that left no other trace in any record that modern humanity can access is held or dropped. Lucas Hale drove back through the Navajo Nation as the morning heated up around him. The red rocks, the blue sky, the immense, indifferent, beautiful emptiness of the Colorado Plateau stretching to every horizon. He did not know what he was going to do with the files. He did not know whether the story he had stumbled into was one that the world was ready to hear. He did not know whether the transition was decades away or years away or already, in ways that he could not yet perceive, underway. What he knew was simpler than any of those questions. He knew that the knowledge existed, that it had been preserved, that people had dedicated their lives, the Hopi elders across generations, the government analysts across decades, and now, in some small way, that he was still processing himself, to ensuring that the pattern was not forgotten, that the warning was not lost. He stopped at a gas station on the edge of the Navajo Nation, and bought a coffee, and stood outside in the morning sun, leaning against his car, looking north toward the mesas. They were visible from there, dark shapes on the horizon, rising above the flat desert floor, ancient, permanent, patient in a way that no human lifetime could fully comprehend. He thought about the September 1945 report. The anthropologist who wrote it had almost certainly never imagined that their fieldwork note would end up classified and filed in a military intelligence archive. They had been doing their job, recording what they saw, trying to understand what they were witnessing. The elders who stopped the interviews had done the same. They had made a decision about what to share and what to withhold, based on their own assessment of what was happening in the world and what that meant for the knowledge they carried. Every person in the chain had done what they believed was right with what they had been given. That was all any of them could do. That was all any of us can do. In the Fourth World or the Fifth, in the time before the threshold or after it, the job is the same. Pay attention, carry what matters, hold the thread. The coffee was bad, the morning was beautiful. The mesas stood on the horizon as they had stood for 1,000 years, and would stand for 1,000 more, regardless of what any government classified or any researcher found, or any individual understood or failed to understand about the pattern that contained them all. Lucas Hale finished his coffee, got back in his car and drove toward the rising sun. Somewhere on those mesas, without announcement, without spectacle, without any of the drama that human beings tend to attach to moments of significance, the ceremony continued, as it always had, as those who carried the knowledge forward across the long dark passage between worlds intended it would. Quiet, persistent, exact. The warning was given, it is still being given, and whether the fifth world begins with recognition, or with whatever comes when recognition fails, that, the Hopi have always said, depends entirely on us. There is a specific detail about the Blue Star Watch program that deserves more attention than it received in the documents Lucas Hale found. The analysts who maintained the restricted astronomical database were not professional astronomers in the academic sense. They were intelligence analysts with specialised training in pattern recognition and data interpretation. They had been given access to telescope networks not because they were equipped to conduct original astronomical research, but because they were equipped to evaluate what they were seeing in the context of the broader archive they were managing. This distinction matters because it shaped how the Blue Star Watch data was interpreted and recorded. A professional astronomer encountering the same unusual periodic object would have approached it with the standard tools of the discipline, attempting to characterize its orbital parameters precisely, working to assign it a catalogue designation, publishing findings in peer-reviewed journals, and inviting the scientific community to verify or dispute the observations. The analysts did none of those things. They watched, they recorded, they cross-referenced. They kept the information in a restricted database that no outside researcher could access, and they formed conclusions not from the astronomical characteristics of the object in isolation, but from the object's behaviour in relation to the full body of evidence they had been accumulating. That context, 50 years of classified cultural intelligence, geological monitoring, atmospheric data, and prophetic correlation analysis, gave the Blue Star Watch its particular significance. To an outside astronomer, an unusual periodic object with a blue spectral signature would have been an interesting astronomical puzzle. To the analysts who had spent their careers immersed in the archive, the same object was something else entirely. It was a data point in a pattern they had been watching for decades. A pattern that, according to every line of analysis they had applied to it, was converging towards something. The object's next closest approach, as estimated in the 2002 projection document, fell within a window that the archive's cultural intelligence timeline had long identified as the period of highest transition probability. The specific years were not named in the projection. The analysts were careful about specificity in a way that suggests they were aware of how the material would read if it ever became public. They dealt in ranges and probabilities, not dates. But the ranges and probabilities they recorded, when placed alongside the Hopi prophetic timeline, and the climate modelling projections and the geological and atmospheric anomaly data, pointed in the same direction. Mid-21st century. That phrase appears in multiple documents from multiple analytical threads within the archive, not as a prediction of a specific catastrophic event, not as a countdown to destruction, but as the convergence point of multiple independent lines of evidence, each suggesting that the period between approximately 2025 and 2050 represented something significant in the long cyclical pattern that the archive had been assembled to document. We are, at the time this is being told, inside that window. This is not stated for effect. It is not an attempt to manufacture urgency where the documents themselves do not support it. It is simply the arithmetic of the archive's own projections, applied to the calendar year in which this account is being presented. The analysts who prepared those projections are, most of them, no longer alive. The program that produced the archive may or may not still be active in some form. The specific server that Lucas Hale accessed has presumably been discovered and properly decommissioned by now. The files it contained either destroyed or moved to a more secure location. What remains is the account, the paper trail, the convergence of evidence assembled by people who had every professional reason to dismiss it, and found, year after year, decade after decade, that they could not. The Hopi elders who spoke publicly, Dana Vihima, Thomas Banyasya, and others whose names appear in the cultural intelligence files, knew that they were unlikely to see the transition themselves. They were old men delivering warnings to a world that largely was not listening. They were not delivering those warnings out of desperation, or because they expected the warnings to prevent what was coming. The Hopi understanding of the transition is not that it can be stopped, it is that it can be navigated, that the difference between surviving the passage between worlds and not surviving it lies not in avoiding the transition, but in being prepared for it, in carrying the right things through, in understanding enough about what is happening to respond to it with the wisdom that the situation requires, rather than the panic that the situation might provoke. This is why the ceremonies continue, not because the ceremonies can delay the transition or accelerate it, but because the ceremonies are the mechanism by which the knowledge is maintained, by which the pattern is kept alive in human awareness, by which the thread of continuity that has been held across previous cycles, through the fire and the ice and the water, is held in this one as well. Whether the knowledge is sufficient, whether enough people carry it forward, whether the recognition the Hopi have been calling for finally comes in time to matter. These questions remain open. They have always remained open. They will remain open until the moment they are answered by the events themselves, and by the choices that the people living through those events make in the time they have. The archive is real, or it is not. The pattern is genuine, or it is an elaborate construction assembled by people who wanted to find a pattern and found what they were looking for. The blue star approaches, or it does not. The Sipapu is a sacred site at the confluence of two rivers in the Grand Canyon, or it is something more than that. The fourth world is in its final phase, or it has been in its final phase for so long that the phrase has lost its meaning. These questions cannot be resolved tonight. They may not be resolvable at all, in the sense that most people mean when they say they want an answer. Something definitive, something certain, something that closes the question and allows life to continue without the discomfort of not knowing. What can be said with certainty is this. The Hopi people have been on those mesas for more than 1,000 years. They have watched empires rise and fall around them. They have watched the world they knew transformed more than once into something unrecognizable. They have maintained their ceremonies and their knowledge and their understanding of the pattern through all of it, not because they were protected from history, not because the events of the world left them untouched, but because they chose, generation after generation, to hold the thread. That is the part of the story that the government archive, for all its extraordinary documentation, never quite captured. Not the geological anomalies or the astronomical objects or the statistical correlations between prophecy and technological development. The part of the story that resists reduction to data points and correlation coefficients and classified memoranda is the part that happens every morning on the mesa, when the sun comes up over the Colorado Plateau and the ceremony is performed, and the knowledge is passed from the people who hold it to the people who will hold it next. That part of the story has been happening for longer than any government program has existed. It will keep happening after every government program has ended, and it will keep happening if the Hopi are right about the pattern on the other side of the threshold as well, in whatever world comes next.